Chris, before you actually start, how did you get into renewables?
Well, as you know, Richard, I've had a long and varied career, starting in education in history of science. I moved out of that at some point into the big world of private enterprise. And during a sort of later stage of my career, when I was looking for a new challenge, I'd always been interested in renewables, and I saw an interesting looking position in a company during the solar panels frenzy about 10 years ago. So I got a job there, and we did very well that first year, but I wanted to diversify into heat pumps, which I saw as being the next big thing. And having met resistance in the company that I was working in, I simply set up on my own as a renewables company, kicking off with the solar, but then rapidly diversifying into heat pumps and training the staff up into heat pumps. And we've never looked back, really. So, yeah.
And how's business at the moment?
At the moment, we're completely run off our feet. There's been a huge sea change. A year or so ago, the vast majority of our customers were just looking to save money on their energy bills, and that was their prime consideration. Most of them weren't really into green issues. It was a purely economic decision. That's changed absolutely completely over the last 12 to 18 months. At least half of our customers now are more interested in the green issues than in purely financial considerations. So it's more or less doubled our turnover. But recruiting staff is our major issue. You can't just pick up heat pump engineers overnight. We have to take on normal plumbers and train them up. That's a long process, and some of them aren't good enough. We have to let them go. So we're absolutely overwhelmed with work at the minute, which is a good thing. Yeah.
Great. So do you want to fire up your presentation and we can get going?
Okay, right. That's fine. That's not okay. So yes, next slide, Richard. Yeah, that's just the title page. So what I've listed here is just a list of common myths that we come across when we're talking to people about heat pumps, and I'll just zap through them for those that can't that have visually impaired. So we've got the first big myth is people think that their house is an older property and not very well insulated, so a heat pump is simply not suitable. The second myth is if you do attempt to put a heat pump into an old uninsulated property, your bills will be extremely high, or it simply won't work unless you've got underfloor heating, or the heat pump won't cope in the depths of winter. It won't be able to heat your house. The other myth is that you're going to need ginormous radiators for the heat pump to work, and that you might not get your water hot enough for a bath. Notice we say bath up here, not bath, so sorry about that. The other one is that the ground source heat pumps are much more efficient than air source and will cope better in winter, and so should always be preferred. And finally, there's a common conception that air source heat pumps are very noisy. So those are the sort of myths that we commonly come across when we talk to people about heat pumps. If you go on to the next slide now, Richard, before I sort of tackle those myths, I'm just going to speak very briefly about how a heat pump works, because this is very pertinent to the whole question. You're all familiar with fridges, and you know that if you stick your hand in the fridge, it's cold, your hand round the back, it's hot. And that's because basically the heat is being extracted from the interior of the fridge and pushed out the back, where it becomes quite hot. So you're all familiar with that technology. The heat pump is working in exactly the same way, except it's pulling the heat out of the air. Now, outside of your house, if it's an air source heat pump, you've got practically an infinite supply of air. So there's lots of heat in the air. It's just that it's at a low temperature. If you squeeze low temperature heat into a smaller volume, then the temperature rockets. It has to go somewhere. This is fundamental gas laws that have been around since the 17th century. So if we've got this infinite amount of air outside that might be as low as -10, if we draw that into the pump and compress it, then the temperature rockets, and then we can use that to heat the house. So that's basically how a heat pump works. Now, my question is to people is, given the fact that we've got this infinite amount of air, why can't we heat any house? We can heat a very well insulated house where the heat demand might not be very great, but simply by increasing the size of the pump, we can heat an uninsulated, larger house. So although insulation is absolutely important because it conserves heat and it stops us using more energy, it's not absolutely essential. If a gas boiler can heat a poorly insulated house, then so can a heat pump. The only thing we have to do is make sure we match the size of the heat pump to the peak heat demand in the middle of winter. And if you do that, a heat pump can do anything a gas boiler can do. The only main difference is that the flow temperature of the water that we're pumping around the house with a heat pump is lower than with a fossil fuel burner. So whereas with a gas boiler, the temperature in your radiators might be at 70 or 80 degrees, with a heat pump, it's going to be maybe somewhere between 35 and 55. So this isn't a problem. All we have to do is increase the surface area of the radiator somewhat to compensate for the lower flow temperature. Now, people are familiar with the fact that if you have underfloor heating, the flow temperature is always lower, somewhere between 35 and 50 degrees, perfect for a heat pump. But because with underfloor heating, you've got this big surface area of the floor, it only needs that lower flow temperature to heat the room. After all, you only want a room at somewhere between 19 and 23. So a flow temperature of 35, 40, 45 is easily adequate to meet that need. And that's why you get a common myth is that heat pumps only work with underfloor heating. Not true. All we have to do is make sure we size the radiators correctly, and it will work equally well with radiators as with underfloor heating. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Richard. So here's a typical house that we've done recently in North Yorkshire. It's an early 18th century stone-built house in an exposed location, quite high up in Yorkshire. It's in a conservation area. Out of the question to put insulation on the outside of these stone walls. So we've got thick stone walls with no insulation on them. We've got solid floor with no insulation. We have got loft insulation, and that's a no-brainer. If you've got a loft, you should insulate it. It's a few hundred quid, it will save you a fortune. It's the first thing you should ever do. And it has got reasonable double glazing. So it's very typical of these retrofit houses that we're fitting heat pumps to it in Yorkshire. In order for the heat pump to work in this house, the first thing we have to do is size the heat pump correctly. And that means doing a few calculations using standards set by the micro certification scheme, the MCS certification standard. And what that standard says is that in an average winter temperature, we've got to achieve 21 degrees in the house, in every room, with no other form of heating. And we can do that easily. You can use the MCS calculation tool. We tend to use one devised by Mitsubishi heat pumps because it uses exactly the same formula working in the background, but it's very easy to use. So I'm just going to zap you through a few figures now, just to show you very briefly how this is done. So if we could have the next slide, please, Richard. So we put in things like the height above sea level. The higher the dwelling is, the lower the temperature is going to be. We've already put the postcode in, so it knows the geographical area and it knows the average winter temperature in those areas. We're putting whether it's in an exposed location, because if it is, then again, we need more heat. We put in the space heating flow temperature that we've chosen, which for an older house, we would always choose at the top end of about 50 degrees. If it were a well-insulated house, we might go down to 45. Could we have the next slide, please, Richard? So we're looking at an average indoor temperature of 21 degrees. That's what we're hoping to achieve. We put in the floor area, the number of stories, the story height. So then this gives us the volume of the house that we're trying to heat in the middle of winter. The average number of air changes per hour, quite high, 1.25 air changes per hour. In a modern building, it would be less than 0.5. It's quite a high. The glazing to wall ratio, you know, the amount of glass that's there, and the rate at which the heat escapes through that glass, which we've got here at 1.8 watts per meter squared for every degree of difference in temperature. If we could go to the next slide, please, Richard. Okay, and then more information's going in here, the amount of loft insulation, the number of external doors, what kind of doors they are, the number of external walls, and again, the rate of heat loss through those walls, and the kind of floor we've got, which is solid with no insulation. And behind these inputs, we've got these algorithms working out, adding up the total heat loss of the dwelling. And if you could go on to the next slide. And here we have the results. So if you look at this second figure down, 9.79, that's telling us what the peak heat loss is in the middle of winter, 9.79 kilowatts. So we need a minimum pump size of around about 10 kilowatts. That's equivalent to 10 one-bar electric fires spread around the house. If we can fit a heat pump that can achieve that, we know we can heat the house in the middle of winter. Underneath that is the total space heating demand of the house in winter. Sorry, over the entire year, which is 22,991 kilowatt hours a year to heat that house. Now, heat pumps, they don't heat a house for free. The heat in the air is free, which we're extracting, but then we have to compress that to get the temperature up, and that requires electrical energy. As a rough average, you get just over 3 kilowatts of heat out for every kilowatt you put in. So the 1 kilowatt you're putting in is from the national grid, and the rest is being extracted from the air. And that's why the figure underneath tells us what the heat pump needs, 6,265 kilowatt hours per year. So for that modest input into the pump, we're getting that total heat demand for the entire year of 22,991. If you were heating the house by direct electricity, that's what you would use, over 22,000 kilowatt hours a year. This shows you how efficient the heat pump is. And as we green up the grid, we're using more and more renewable energy to provide that heat demand. And then we get an approximate cost for heating the house. And the CO2 emissions that are used in that space heating, which is less than a third of what you would be using with direct electric. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Richard. So the next job we have to do, having sized the heat pump, is to look at each individual room and size the heat loss of each individual room. And this is where a lot of installations can fall down. If you don't do this and you just leave in the normal radiators, those radiators won't be able to meet the heat demand of the room. They'll keep calling for heat from the heat pump. It still can't heat the room because the emitter isn't big enough. So you end up with a high bill and cold rooms. And this gives rise to a lot of the myths around heat pump. If you get poor installation, poor design. So if you look at the third column from the right and look down the bottom, you'll see the figure of 10,260. And when we've done this room by room calculation, we get a slightly modified figure from what we had before, because this is much more accurate. So this is telling us that we need a slightly bigger pump, 10.26 kilowatts. We actually installed an 11.2, so it gives us a bit of spare capacity. And the figures above that are the demand for each individual room. If you could go to the next slide, please, Richard.
Sorry, Chris, just for clarification, these are, again, peak demand.
These are the peak demands in the middle of winter.
Yes.
You won't get anything like this once you get out of the winter.
Yeah.
So that's the peak demand in the middle of winter. Yeah. So if we could go to the next slide, we then can calculate what size radiators we need for each room. Now, in this particular house, there weren't any radiators in, they were on storage heaters. So we had to install a complete new wet system. So the left-hand column, which normally gives you your existing radiator, is blank because there weren't any. The right-hand column tells us what we need to fit. And if we fit those radiators, we will meet the heat demand of every room in the house. Just to give you an example of what that means when you're replacing existing radiators, could we go to the next slide, please, Richard? So this is another house we did, which had about 9 or 10 radiators in it, and we had to replace 4 or 5. Some of them will already be big enough, you see. You don't necessarily have to replace every radiator. And the size difference isn't that great. So if you look at the living room, we have a radiator that's 600 mil high by 1900 wide, and we're replacing that with one that's 600 mil high by as little as about 1600 wide, but we've increased the thickness of the radiator from a single convector with 1 set of fins to a double convector with 2 sets of fins. So the actual profile of the radiator may not look, in this instance, we would fit 1900. So it doesn't disrupt the pipes going into the radiator. We don't have to repipe it. And the look of the room remains exactly the same. We're just fattening it up a little bit. And if you look down the differences down each of these columns, you'll see we've managed to achieve the same in every room. So you're not looking at vastly increased radiator sizes. We're just fattening them up a bit to make sure they can supply the correct amount of heat to every room. So that was done with an air source heat pump in an early 19th century building. The one complaint we had from the customer at the end of November was she couldn't get the bedrooms cool enough. Not that it wasn't supplying enough heat, but the bedrooms were too warm. She turned off all the radiators in the bedrooms, but the heat coming up from the ground floor was still making her feel a bit warm at night. So we suggested she set back the temperature at night to reduce the amount of heat coming up from downstairs. So there's no problem at all with supplying sufficient heat to that house. With heat pump, it's essential that you use continuous heating, so you're not on and off like a gas boiler. Because of the low flow temperature, it takes longer to reheat a house once it's gone very cold. Now, reheating is not without costs, because if you're heating something up from cold, that requires a lot of energy. If you're keeping the whole house at a reasonable temperature constantly, then you don't need those great big boosts of energy that you tend to use with a gas boiler. And in fact, your heating costs come down. So we tend to tell people to use continuous heating at as lower an ambient temperature as is comfortable, and set it back maybe a degree or two at night at the most, but don't let your house get too cold. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Richard. So this is a second example, and with this one we fitted a ground source heat pump. Now this is an 18th century building. In what you can see is all 18th century. There is a more modern extension out the back built around about 2000. So this is a bit of a mixture. And as I say, with this one, we fitted a ground source heat pump. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Richard. So with ground source, we're collecting the heat from about a metre below the ground rather than the air. And you can see the depth we're going to. That's 1.2 metres deep, that trench. We actually, each of these trenches is 50 metres long, and we fitted 4 of these. We installed 4 of these, what they call slinkers, these circular pipes, to meet the heat demand of the house. Now, with the ground source, there's another complication. Whereas with the air, you've got an infinite amount of air to draw on. With ground source, you've only got the ground that you've put the ground collectors in. So you have to ensure that you are using enough ground to meet the heat demand of the house, so that you do not exhaust the ground of heat and run out of heat during the winter. So again, you need additional calculations to work out the area of ground you need to be drawing heat from. Each of these trenches have to be 5 metres apart from the centres, otherwise you're drawing on the same bit of ground in order for it to work. Now, it's not geothermal. Geothermal, to get that's heat coming from the Earth's core, you have to go down 500 metres. This heat is coming from the sun. It's Earth that's been drenched by sunshine and warmed by the sun during the spring and summer, and we then extract that heat during the whole year in order to heat the house and heat up the domestic hot water. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Richard. So I've just put up here a quote from that particular customer. And the reason I'm flashing this up, which I'm just going to read very quickly, is because it answers most of these myths that we had at the beginning. I can send anyone that's interested the entire email we got from this customer. Was absolutely delighted with the system. And what he says was that one benefit that he hadn't really considered was that his house is always warm. Yeah. And he says it might sound daft, but in his previous expensive oil system, he had to run it hard, for 3 hours of periods, 2 3-hour periods a day. And the temperature was oscillating up and down. And some rooms in the extremities were cold. They have the ground source heat pump always on ready, so that when it needs heat, it's there ready to put the heat into the house. He set his temperature down to 19.5 because that's what it was comfortable for him, and the whole house is warm. The new radiators are far less intrusive than he feared. As I was saying earlier, they don't have to go for massive radiators. And the really impressive thing was the hot water temperature. One of the myths is that you won't. We had a customer ring us up once in a panic halfway through an installation. He said, my plumber's told me with this heat pump, I'll never be able to have a bath again because it won't get me water hot enough. Well, when the heat pump's doing space heating, it will target the temperature needed to heat the room. It may be anywhere between 35 and 50 degrees. When it's heating up your hot water, it targets 55 degrees to get the water in the cylinder up to 55. Now, most people shower or bath at around about 38 or 40. 55 you can't lie in. In fact, with modern building regulations, you're not allowed to have an output at a bath hotter than 48, because higher than that can scald people. So 55, you're still having to add cold water to it. So as I say, we had this guy ringing us up saying, my plumber's told me I won't be able to have a bath. I said, fine, you've only paid a deposit. When we've finished, we're going to lay your plumber in the bath. We're going to turn it on with no cold. And if you can line it for more than 10 seconds, we'll give you all your money back. Needless to say, we got paid. So we can heat the hot water up to a very satisfactory level using a heat pump. And as this guy says, he thought for a while he'd left his immersion heater on because the water was too hot. So as he says in the last paragraph, too early to talk about economics, but the demand seems in line with the winter estimate in this wet and quite chilly November, December. And it's looking very much in line with what we told him it would cost, which was significantly less than what he was spending, the £2,800 a year he was spending on oil. So I don't know if we can very quickly, Richard, whip back to those myths that we started with at the beginning, to the second slide, and just see how many of those we've maybe addressed in the talk. Could we do that?
Yeah, we could do that.
Zap, 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 zap. Right, okay. So these are both older properties that I've chosen deliberately, not particularly well insulated. The bills are not high. They don't have underfloor heating. There was a bit of underfloor heating in the second property, but most of it was radiators. They're both well heated in winter, if anything, too warm. They're not having to install huge radiators. The water is well hot enough for a bath. And in terms of noise, that's one of the things we haven't addressed with the modern air source heat pumps are very quiet. The sort of output of an efficient air source heat pump in terms of noise is when it's going full whack, that's in the middle of winter or on the hot water cycle, is about the same volume as you'd get from a domestic microwave. Yeah. With the windows closed, you hear nothing. It's only when you're outside you hear a gentle hum. We do advise not to put it under a bedroom window because you might have that window open in summer and it might be doing the hot water cycle. You might be able to hear it. But other than that, they're very, very quiet. Often a lot quieter than the noise transmitted through the flue of a gas boiler or an oil boiler. So noise has never been, people always ask about this before we install. We don't get any issues after installation. The other thing that's often thought is that ground source heat pumps are much more efficient than air source. I'd be very interested to see if anybody's got access to a study doing a really scientific comparison of an air source and a ground source in the UK in terms of efficiency. I haven't seen one. We've fitted about 40 ground source, about 200 air source. The results we get back from our customers tell us that they're all getting more than 3 to 1 as a ratio. You can't compare one with the other because no two houses are alike. So I'm not sure what the difference is. I suspect the ground source is a bit more efficient, but not much more, and certainly not enough to justify the huge extra costs that are involved in a ground source. Can we now flip back forwards again, Richard, to the next slide on from where we stopped before? Right, so air source or ground source? Well, typical cost of an air source installation, 11,250. Typical cost of a ground source, 27,500. Now, currently, both of these technologies are heavily supported by government subsidy called the Renewable Heat Incentive. You have to pay this money up front, but then you're paid 28 equal installments under the Renewable Heat Incentive. The maximum you can get for an air source is £11,000. The maximum you can get for a ground source is £31,000. Take these subsidies away, and who is going to install a ground source as opposed to an air source? You might get a 10% greater efficiency on the ground source. Is that going to justify this huge extra cost? That's if you've got the land. That's if you've got this big area of land, approximately 800 square meters for an average house. somewhere between 6 and 1,000 square meters. If you haven't, you're talking about boreholes. Add an extra £10,000 to that cost for boreholes. Completely financially ruinous for a single dwelling. Boreholes are only worth looking at for multiple dwellings or blocks of flats where the cost is spread over a large number of dwellings. So once the subsidies have gone, I think ground source installation will be quite rare. Could we go on to the next slide, please, Richard? So this is something that Richard's done for us. He's looked at the Energy Saving Trust, at the carbon reduction of various retrofit options, and at the installation costs. And he's come up with this graph. And basically, what this is showing us is that, you know, you can do loft insulation, cavity wall insulation. You can see that certainly loft insulation is very, very cheap, and you get quite a good return. On the left-hand axis, you've got the cost of installation. On the right hand, the carbon reduction. If you're wanting to make a big impact on your carbon footprint, it's a no-brainer. Just look what you're getting on the air source heat pump. It's very high up there, far more than you'll get through any other measure that you can take. So insulation, yes, it's low-hanging fruit. It's very important. If you insulate well, you need a smaller pump. Your bills will be lower. The same would be true of a gas boiler or any other form. But if you can't, if you're living in an old house where solid wall insulation would be impractical and so would floor insulation, it's not a no-go area for a heat pump. You can still have a heat pump in a poorly insulated house, is the lesson to take from this. But yes, insulation is important. You should do it wherever possible. But it is not, it doesn't disbar you from having a heat pump. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, please, Richard, which again, Richard has prepared for us. One of the interesting things this shows is that with an air source heat pump, the national grid is now a lot greener than it used to be. We're looking about 210 to 20 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt produced. When we started, it was 500 or 600. As the grid gets greener and greener, your air source heat pump is getting greener and greener without you doing a thing. Yeah, so as the grid gets more and more input from solar and wind, and your energy that you're drawing from the grid is getting greener and greener, then your heat pump's getting greener and greener without you having to do anything else at all. Could we go on to the next slide, please, Richard? And this is, if you want to get even more green, you stick some solar panels on, because the heat pump's using electricity as its input. If some of that electricity is coming free from the sun with zero carbon, then obviously that's going to drive down the carbon footprint of your heat pump, plus your general electricity usage even more. People rightly say, well, you need most energy into the heat pump in winter, and that's when you get least from the sun. This is absolutely true. However, you need hot water all the year round. If you have a decent sized solar array during the summer, virtually all of that hot water will be heated by the heat pump free from the solar panels. During the spring and the autumn, you will be getting significant inputs into the heat pump when you still need some heating from the solar panels. Generally, in an average size house with a 4 kilowatt solar PV system, we can reduce the running cost of a heat pump by around about 25%. A 4 kilowatt system will give you 3,500 kilowatt hours a year. The average house will need 6,000 kilowatt hours a year to run. So you're providing half of that energy for the heat pump from the solar. Even if it's not going into your heat pump, it's going into the grid and offsetting your carbon footprint. That combination of solar plus a heat pump, it's a magical combination. All your energy is coming from the sun. The vast majority of your energy is then coming from the sun. So that's a new build there where we can fit the panels flush with the roof. Black panels can look very, very neat. If you just go on to the next slide, please, Richard. This is more of a retrofit option where they're sitting proud on the roof because you've not got a stripped roof to deal with. The panels are now 50% more efficient than they were 8 years ago when we started, and they cost 1/3 of the price. That's unbelievable. The advances in solar technology and price reduction are phenomenal. we were using 16 panels costing £13,000 not that long ago. We're now using 11 or 12 panels for the same amount of energy costing £4,000 now. It's a massive advance in solar technology. So even though there's virtually no subsidy now for solar, it's still a no-brainer because you get the benefits back very quickly in reduction in your electricity bills. So I think that's as far as I want to go at the moment, Richard. We could maybe throw it open to questions now.
Yeah. Shall I stop sharing the presentation?
Yes, you can if you like.
Well, I can't see my, oh, there it is, my mouse. Stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, I don't know, I can't see the, oh, how do I get the Zoom pictures back? Okay, here we are. Right, so I've got some some questions that came before. So I'll just rattle through some of these. So we've done quite well on the time.
Good, yeah.
And also, Richard, there's quite a few questions that have come from everyone listening as well in the chat.
Yeah, no. So shall I start with those and have a, or start with some of the ones we've had before? I think one of the questions is, you know, what is a typical? I know you're saying about over 50% now are doing it for green reasons, but obviously the financials are still important for many people. So with the benefit of this renewable heat incentive, what typically is the payback period?
Well, typically you'll get most of your installation costs back within 7 years. Now, the other half of the equation is, are there running cost savings? And that depends on what your running costs were before. Certainly, if you add solar to the equation, you will get significant savings even over gas. Because gas is so cheap at the moment, if you've got a brand new gas boiler, you're not going to make any savings by just installing a heat pump. Costs will be similar. The gas may even be slightly cheaper. If you're looking to change your gas boiler, which is maybe going to cost you £2,000 or £3,000, that old gas boiler is probably only working at 70 or 75%, in which case the heat pump, even with the differential in electricity and gas prices, will work out cheaper. And you may as well shove that £2,000 or £3,000 into your installation costs. So with the renewable heat incentive, you could end up being £2,000 better off than you were if you installed a gas boiler, and your running costs will certainly be less than your old gas boiler. So if you're replacing an old gas boiler with a heat pump, you can look to sort of breaking even on your investment within 6, maybe 7 years.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I think there were some questions here about, which I think you've answered, about can you heat an old house? Yes, you've said. You don't. People, I've seen even Green Party people saying you need deep retrofit before you can even consider a heat pump.
I think where that comes from. It's a mystery to me why they think you don't need deep retrofit to make a gas boiler work, but you do with a heat pump. I have no idea where that idea comes from.
Yeah,
it simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all.
Yeah. There was one little technical question about what does air change mean? I think that might be helpful for a lot of people.
Yes, it's just the number of times that the air changes within a dwelling. Obviously, as the air leaves, it takes the heat with it. You're bringing colder air in, and you've got to heat that air up. So it's the number of times the air changes within a dwelling or a room per hour. Yeah. And that will depend on how airtight the dwelling is. Some houses are built so airtight, you need mechanical ventilation in order to get, you need a certain amount of air change to keep the air fresh. But if you have too much, you're losing a lot of heat. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned about the very, very dramatic improvements in solar. Have there been equivalent improvements in in heat pumps?
Yeah, the heat pumps are getting more and more efficient, but they're not getting any cheaper. Right. And I think the reason for that is certainly installation costs are always going to be high because it's a very labor-intensive process. but also it's the way heat pumps are put together. They can't be automated in the same way that, say, a gas boiler can. A lot of the savings in production had already been met because, basically a lot of the components are the same as you get in an air conditioning unit. You're just reversing it. So unlike the solar, which came on new to the market, and you could, mechanize it and, get huge economies of scale, we're not seeing those in heat pumps. So I don't expect there to be, I think if we get a huge demand for heat pumps, you will see some reduction in cost, but not to the same extent that we've seen in solar.
But just to add something I know, I think the Energy Saving Trust 10 years ago did a survey of air source heat pumps, and they reckoned on average this seasonal coefficient of performance was about 2.2. I think now it's up to over 3. So that's quite a dramatic, that's a 50% improvement in 10 years. So,
a lot of those improvements is to do with quality of installation as well as quality of the pumps.
Okay.
Since MCS standards were introduced, but also this year, some of the new models coming out are quoting by the manufacturers, COPs of 3.5, 3.7, but we've yet to see what they actually perform in practice. So there is an upward trend in efficiency, and there's no reason why we can't get even more efficient.
Now, I think all the costs you showed were full project costs, weren't they? Because there was a question about does this include the work, the labour and radiators? But the costs you were giving were full project costs, weren't they?
They were, yeah. But as I say, those are average costs for a reasonable size, sort of 3-bedroom semi. Obviously, with the larger houses, the costs do go up, and the number of radiators you have to change go up.
So I'm just trying to see. So could underfloor heating with a heat pump be installed in a lined, or was that listed building? Lined under a timber suspended floor?
Yes, you can do. Underfloor heating gets a lot more expensive if you're not using the standard screed system, whereby you just put down insulation, clip to the insulation, screed over the top. That's the cheapest way of doing it. Once you get into suspended floors, you then either need an overlay system where you put in a sense, a very low, almost like a new floor with the pipes already in it. And that's expensive because you've got the structure of the boards as well, and the fitting is longer. Or you suspend between joists. Now, neither of those two systems are quite as efficient as a standard screeded system, and they're a lot more expensive. And generally, if you're going to have to go down that route, you need to think very carefully about whether that's the best route to go down, or bung a radiator in. Yeah. Just to give you an idea, on a screeded system, the materials cost, leaving aside the labour, is about £20 a square metre. So if you have a 20-metre square room, it's going to cost you 400 quid in materials, then the labour to do the screeded system. If you're going overlay or between joists, you're looking at closer to £50 a square metre. That's a massive extra cost, and your labour costs tend to be higher as well. And for what? If you can fit a radiator in the room, a reasonable size, you're looking at a few £100s to pipe and fit a radiator.
Yeah.
There are big financial constraints on doing that, but you can do it. Some people want to do it for comfort reasons, and because they don't want radiators stuck around the walls. But that's a different incentive. Yeah.
Yeah, there's quite an important question here. They're all great questions, by the way, everybody. And we will endeavour to make sure they're all answered if we run out of time, but we're doing quite well. So someone, I think, Nathan, thank you for this question. He's saying that to get the RHI, he's been told he needs to carry out all the installation recommended on the EPC. Is that right?
No, it's not right. There are only 2 eligibility criteria that you have to do. If the EPC specifies under the recommended measures loft insulation, you have to do it. Now, I'm saying loft, not room in roof. If you've got rooms in the roof,
like this one,
you don't have to do it. If you've got a loft and it's not insulated to a minimum standard, you have to insulate it, and that's very cheap. And the second eligibility criteria is if you have a cavity wall, then it must be filled. If you haven't got a cavity wall, you don't need to do anything. It may recommend internal or external wall insulation, but it's not an eligibility criteria for the RHI. Even if you have a cavity, some cavities are not suitable to be filled. And if you get a RICS surveyor's report to say it's not suitable to be filled, then you can still get the RHI without filling it, but you need a report to send in. So there's only those two things. You'll get lots of recommendations on the EPC, but it's only those two that you need to fulfill in order to claim the RHI.
Yeah, yeah.
I know this because I personally help every customer to apply for the RHI. So we do all these. We've never failed to get anybody through. So we know the eligibility criteria back to front. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was. I mean, Tim, thank you for your thing. Tim is Tim Martell, who's, by the way, one of the foremost experts in. He's a retrofit assessor in the Stroud Valleys, and I'd highly recommend. He's given a talk to us before, actually, but he was saying that the Energy Saving Trust figures on the efficiency of heat pumps is sort of like 2.45 for an air source and 2.82 for a ground source. I think, Tim, that is really, really quite out of date. The Irish did a study, and during the Beast from the East, they were getting 2.5 on average from an air source heat pump.
That's during very cold weather.
Yeah, yeah.
So over the year as a whole, that figure will.
I think that data is actually quite, and we probably do need some more up-to-date studies done based on real-world, kind of situations. But, right. So. Actually, I want to ask you a question. When a customer comes to you and asks you for a heat pump, what's the first question you ask them?
First question I ask them is why are they interested in fitting a heat pump? Because we need to know what the motivation is. Is it to lower their carbon footprint? Is it to reduce bills? Or is it both?
Or comfort?
Or comfort, yeah. So we need to know why they're doing it, and then we advise them accordingly. If they've got a brand new gas boiler and a well-insulated house, then my advice is going to be, if it's to save money, you're not going to save money by fitting a heat pump, because your brand new gas boiler is working at over 90%. Gas is ridiculously cheap. If we actually tax gas for the carbon, it wouldn't be, but we don't. The RHI refund is not going to be that great, because if the heat loss of the RHI is paid according to the amount of heat the heat pump has to produce, according to the EPC. So if you have a very low heat loss, your grant actually goes down, but your installation costs might not go down that much. So if it's purely financial in those circumstances, we'd be saying it's probably not the thing to do, because we don't want them ringing us up in a year's time saying we haven't saved any money. If it's green credentials, then that's a completely different issue. If you wanted to get your carbon footprint, if they've got an old gas boiler that they're thinking to replace, then yes, put that money towards your heat pump. Yeah, and your old gas boiler will be an energy guzzler anyway, so you will say your running costs will be lower, and you'll do well on the RHI. So we can recommend it. If it's a mixture of green and economic reasons, that's another reason. Comfort is often is important too, and there are certainly huge advantages from an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump. The fact that your radiators are not scalding hot can be important, whether you get old people that might collapse onto them, or where you've got young children that could burn themselves on them. So it's a much gentler, nicer form of heat that keeps the house warm all the time. So there are comfort issues involved here as well. Yeah, so we need to see what they're doing it for, in order to advise them. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got 10 more minutes. We've got one here from Sally, Sally Thorpe, who's our chair of NailsworthCAN. Mm-hmm. Does the huge number of houses needing retrofitting to get off gas and oil how big a how big a part can air source heat pumps play?
Well, it can
Big
play,
strategic question, isn't it?
it can play a huge part, but before it can, what we really need is a transformation of training and education, because there aren't the people out there to do it. The colleges are still churning out people that all they know about is gas and oil. They're not training for the future. The government's got a target, I think, by 2030 to be installing 600,000 heat pumps a year. We probably do just over 1% of the heat pumps in the UK, and I would need to increase my workforce tenfold to do my bit of that. And I can't find, we have to take people on the, normal plumbers from gas or whatever, or take apprentices on. It takes us ages to train them up. And the colleges aren't turning them out. We need a massive change in education of heating engineers in order to achieve that.
Right. And there's a question about micro-bore radiator pipes. I mean, if you come across, I mean, sometimes is it more than simply the radiators? Is sometimes the actual pipe work needing changing?
Micro-bores aren't ideal because you can't get the flow rate that you need at the lower flow temperature, and they also have a tendency to silt up as well. So it depends on the extent of the micro-bore.
Yeah.
A lot of micro-bore is just drop downs from a standard pipe, and the micro-bore run is quite short. Now, we have installed in such systems, and we've always forewarned the customer that if there's an issue, they might incur extra costs in changing those micro-bores.
Right.
If the whole house is in micro-bore, I wouldn't even attempt it without changing it. Right. And that would be a significant extra cost. In the ones we have retrofitted, where it's just been drop downs to the radiators from wider pipes, we haven't had an issue. So it's not a no-no, but it is a known issue that you need to look at carefully. You need to take careful advice. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll keep going until 5:10, and I think we'd probably want to try and do a kind of summary and wind up of what's happening. So I think there are a few questions about smart systems, either smart controls on radiators or even web-based, I want the system to change when I'm, perhaps going away for the weekend or whatever it is, or those kinds of things. I mean, what's happening with smart systems, smart controls?
Smart controls aren't always ideal with heat pumps because they're often wanting to turn things on and off according to patterns of behavior. And with heat pumps, it's better to have continuous heating. Some heat pumps already have quite smart controls built into them. So for example, with the Mitsubishi one, you can plug in, you can type it, you can put it into holiday mode and just put in the dates, and it will drop the temperature right down when you go away and start heating up the house gently the day before you come back. So they also have weather compensation curves built into them, which is quite a smart form of control. And what that means is, although we might design a system to run at 50 degrees, we only need that 50 degrees in winter. As soon as the outside ambient temperature starts to increase to say 10 or 12 degrees, we don't actually need 50 degrees flowing through the radiators to get a nice 21 inside. So the heat pump, looking at the external temperature has gone up, will drop the flow temperature. So maybe 45 or 40 or even 35. And that's when you get people ringing you up and saying, the heat pump's not working. And you say, why? How do you know? Well, my radiator's cold. Yeah, well, what's the temperature in the room? Yeah. Look at the room temperature, not the temperature of the radiator, because the radiator might actually be cooler than your body temperature, which is 37, 38. But as long as it's warm enough to heat the room, that's fine. Yeah. So they already have a certain amount of smart controlling, but you don't want smart controls that were specifically designed for a gas boiler. Yeah,
I mean, I think this fiddling with the controls we've got used to with gases because the thing's going like this, isn't it? Yeah, you're actually trying to.
Basically, you want to set the controls to a comfortable level and leave them alone.
Yeah, yeah. So I see how many. Just one more, I think. There's an important question from Rosemary about maintenance costs and how that. What do you have to maintain with an air source heat pump, for example?
Well, There's not a lot to maintain. Maintenance costs are probably a bit higher than a gas boiler, mainly because it's mainly on the cylinder side the costs are incurred. So basically, with a heat pump, you're using an unvented cylinder which is under pressure, and there are lots of safety devices associated with that: expansion vessels, pressure relief valves, all this sort of thing. So they really need to checking once a year to make sure they're all functioning properly, which is mainly you do certain measurements on the pressure relief valve, make sure that it's still going to release pressure if it builds up. You need to check that the expansion vessel is charged. You need to check the pipe work to make sure there's no leaks. You check the settings on the pump, make sure it's not got, the fins haven't got clogged up with leaves and all the rest of it. So the maintenance costs aren't huge. You're probably looking at 120, 140 pounds a year for a full maintenance check. We as a company do the first year free, so it's 2 years before you need to pay anything. Ground source again costs more because you've got to check the antifreeze levels in the ground source. You've got to check the fusion joints on the ground source, the pressure levels. So it is slightly more on the ground side, ground source heat pumps again, than it would be on an air source. So you're not looking at horrendous costs. No.
Right. Okay. So I think we probably, Jen, do you think we probably need to get into the final stages here? I just want to say, I think that was really, you packed in a lot in there. There's still a lot of questions which are not answered. So I've got some notes here. I'll endeavour to get answers to those questions and include it in our write-up. If you've not already visited our website, if you go to www.NailsworthCAN.org, you'll see, you know, we try to keep the word count low, and we've got a tab on there which is blog, and you'll see some blogs which are with the previous conversation. So Chris's talk was the third in the series, and we'll have a blog related to this talk with a link to the video which we'll upload onto YouTube, so you'll be able to access it there. And what I'll endeavour to do is have some answers to those questions incorporated into that. So and anyone who wasn't able to make it tonight, they can catch up by seeing it there. So I think the final thing to do really is to say, you know, thanks very much, and you know, we really want to really take on board everything you've said and explore how we can take this forward, I suppose, within our area, and talking to the various stakeholders. I think my experience has been that even with people who are passionate about greening up our energy, there's a huge number in, shall we say, in the retrofit business who I think are working on out-of-date information, or they've had some bad experiences with heat pumps, and those have become fixed as a kind of almost a fixed idea. And I think that it's refreshing to see that you're having so much success with them. And I think we need to kind of refresh the knowledge base, shall we say, in terms of the retrofit community. So thanks very much. So I think if everyone can unmute themselves, and we can give Chris a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant.
Good, Jen.